people
mean very little to
people who
most
don't
people.
like Boris Johnson already or don't like the government already will be enraged by this. People who are inclined to think that something nefarious went on already will be confirmed in their view. But whether it will change the minds of anyone else, I'm less clear.
Front page of this morning's Times. This afternoon is the deadline for the Cabinet Office to hand over WhatsApps to the COVID inquiry or not. Let's have a listen to William Hague speaking about this on Times Radio Breakfast this morning. He argues that some things should be kept private.
I think that the problem here is the precedent set for the future. I think when you're in a crisis, and I've been in a few, what you most need is people who will give you honest, uninhibited advice, who will say, actually, what my boss told you is just now is wrong. Or actually, I have a completely different view to what everybody just said in that meeting. And so, well, now all of that takes place on WhatsApp now. And I think that if those messages are all then to be given an inquiry on whatever said, they're going to be less likely to give that honest advice.
Do you now think, Danny, when you were working for Conservative leaders, you were lucky not to be working in the era of WhatsApp and constant digital communications that were liable to be handed over to statutory bodies at any given time?
Yes, probably. And the Conservative Party was at that point so far behind Labour in terms of its communication and technology that even if we'd been in the right age, we wouldn't have had the right equipment. And I do sort of remember doing the budget once and listening to Tony Blair's reply and having to watch it on the television, then call it down the line, and then the television went off because I didn't have all of Tony Blair's reply when it was really quite amateur. So yes, we do. We're lucky we didn't live in that age. One of the things that's very interesting about being an advisor to governments or politicians who are in government is you constantly get this advice: don't set the precedent. It's often legal advice, and politically it's highly difficult to follow. And it happened during the 1997 election with Neil Hamilton and the Privileges Committee. It was a political disaster for the Conservative Party not to be forced to follow precedent, and that's what they're engaged in here. I think they've, as well as following William's advice about precedent, they've got to look for a way out. Maybe the right thing is to say precedent means this cannot be made public, but we will be willing to show the inquiry chairman the WhatsApp so that they can satisfy themselves. Because this line, in my view, while it may hold legally, while it may hold in terms of precedent, it won't hold.
Miranda, what do you think? And also, how would Paddy Ashdown, for whom you worked, coped in the WhatsApp era?
Well, I mean, I'm still surprised what people will put in an email, to be honest. And back in those days, I would have said you just always were very careful not to put things in an email. You wouldn't want in private eye. That was our test, the private eye test. I mean, I think they'll probably be worried about what leaks, even if Danny's suggestion were taken up. But, I have to say, some of the objections, as, eloquently voiced by William Hague there, do remind me of all of the arguments against bringing in freedom of information legislation in the late 90s by the Blair government. It was the same sort of arguments were used. You want political advice to be given frankly. You want the conversations to be open. You want people playing devil's advocate so that you get the best possible policy making, and therefore we shouldn't make it public ever. And of course, Tony Blair famously regretted introducing freedom of information legislation. But as we know, as journalists, it's been absolutely crucial in terms of scrutiny of government and in terms of, uncovering dodgy dealings. So I think there are strong arguments on both sides. And really, because the whole COVID process was conducted in such a panic, it was really unprecedented crisis that the government had to deal with. There would be very, very important lessons learned if we knew everything that happened. So I'm pretty much on the side of full disclosure, but it's shaping up into a major conflict, really, between Lady Hallett and her inquiry and the government. So, I think sparks will continue to fly.
And how damaging do you think this entire process, because obviously this is, the sort of process before the process itself, before politicians themselves, a question before the inquiry, Danny, how damaging do you think this has the possibility to be? I guess, if talks, if rather, public sessions are happening next year in the run-up to an election, how damaging do you think that could be for Rishi Sunak and his government.
Look, the truth about this, and it may not be a comfortable one, and people always get annoyed when one says this, but it's true. Most people will not have noticed this story. Most people will not follow this in great amount of detail. So I think the way that we should try to discuss it is this the right thing to do? What will be the precedent? And we are very much stuck between the two things. One is I want to know absolutely everything that particularly Boris Johnson's government and his advisors got up to, because you unfortunately cannot trust the things that they say in public. We have learnt that what he claims in public is not necessarily true. That is, I know this will sound odd to listeners, quite unusual. I think Miranda will probably agree. It's quite unusual for a politician to sort of go quite that far from what is factually on the record. So I do want to know. But on the other hand, the precedent issue is an important one as well. So you are stuck. So I think they've got to find some way out of it. And my concern here isn't really that I think it's going to be a big issue for the government. Sometimes these things catch on, and it could be, but it's most of the time a detail like this. Discussion with the inquiry and everything.
Words like cabinet office.
Yeah, well, people who don't like Boris Johnson already or don't like the government already will be enraged by this. People who are inclined to think that something nefarious went on already will be confirmed in their view. But whether it will change the minds of anyone else, I'm less clear.
I think Danny might be taking a disproportionate amount of comfort from the quite correct assertion that many people will not follow the detail and the ins and outs of the inquiry story. Because I think actually, even for Rishi Sunak's government, desperate as he is to say that this is a new era, that he's turned the page on the Johnson and Truss era, the kind of bad smell, particularly about issues like cronyism, really, really big money contracts over PPE, etc. That sort of whiff around the Tory party is going to be quite difficult to play down, as the sort of phony war hots up towards the general election.
I totally agree with that. I mean, I don't say any comfort from it particularly. I don't really mind whether. Well, I'm just trying to sort of analyse what I think.
Okay, they
what I
would
think
be
might
taking
happen.
too much comfort. I think
that's possible.
And also, isn't it the case that, as was the case when Matt Hancock's WhatsApps were leaked wholesale to the Daily Telegraph, that people inevitably focus on the trivia and the intemperate remarks Boris Johnson may or may not have made. If these WhatsApps are released wholesale, will they? Obviously, there'll be a great wealth of historical record, but what people will end up talking about isn't necessarily what it tells us about the decision-making structures or lack thereof in Number 10. People will be talking about, I don't know, whatever off-colour joke Boris Johnson has made on any given afternoon.
I remember a whole thing with David Cameron where how he used the word LOL, which was where he thought it meant lots of love, whereas in fact it means laugh out loud. And I knew that because he'd sent me the message LOL when my father died, and so I realised he must have meant lots of love. So you do get concentrate on people will concentrate on that, but nevertheless we will learn from this, and there'll be a nagging feeling that the inquiry isn't getting everything if it doesn't have access to all the information and the way that people exchange information in government. So I see why the inquiry wants it, and I think they have to have some method of satisfying the inquiry about the content of it. And so I don't think the line the government's taking, while it may hold up in court, why it may hold up in kind of arguments about precedents, will not work politically, and they will have to find some solution to it.
Miranda, speaking of safe spaces for government communication, you've been writing about the safest space of all for any cabinet minister, country houses like Chequers.
Yeah, so all the furore about what went on in the Johnson era, again, has kind of focused on his social circle and, whether inappropriate socialising was going on during lockdown. And it has spotlighted the use of Chequers, the country house that's in trust for the use of prime ministers of the day. And I was trying to look a bit more broadly at, these grace and favour houses, because it's quite a unique and interesting sort of facet of our government. And, there's such sort of disapproval, really, of the political class generally. I'd be really interested what Danny thinks about this, that there's a sort of assumption now that anything that looks like a perk of office is just automatically sort of condemned. But actually, you know, I talked to Anthony Selden, the historian of recent political history, about it, and there is quite a good case, not just for continuing the use of places like Chequers and Chevening and Dorney Wood, which are the other two near London, which are reserved for senior members of the cabinet, and even a question as to whether we actually underuse them. You know, I mean, what's this country got going for it at the moment? And as you can see from the Netflix show The Diplomat, one of the things we've got going for us is still this incredible architectural backdrop. And why don't we actually use these houses more for diplomacy, for kind of showing off British cultural riches? And so I think actually, you know, you could say that rather than just letting Boris Johnson or, you know, his successors and predecessors go there, in the immortal words of Danny Dyer, to put their trotters up, you know, maybe we should actually be using them more actively for government to, you know, convene international conferences, you know, solve climate change, you know, devise a peace plan for Ukraine, whatever it is, because they're fantastic.
Well, as US presidents have done with varying degrees of effectiveness in the past at Camp David and other sort of retreats, Danny.
Yeah, there's a fantastic
Camp David. Why not turn it into Camp David? Yeah,
there's a fantastic occasion where the Prime Minister of Malta tries to get Ted Heath to solve his marital Don Mintoff tries to get Ted Heath to solve his marital problems by having a convening with his wife at Chequers, and it didn't work, by the way. And nobody could have been less suitable at such a piece of peacemaking than
domestic
Ted Heath.
peacemaking.
Domestic peacemaking than Ted Heath. They are extraordinary places, and I've been to a few meetings there, which are, you know, which wouldn't have worked in Downing Street, and which also, you know, took account of the fact that the Prime Minister living in an apartment inside Westminster, it actually is a good idea if they go somewhere else, and so I'm in favour of using those things in the way that Miranda suggests. You know, but it isn't necessary. Who knows whether this is what's happened, because it hasn't been judged yet. It isn't necessary for someone obviously to use those in contravention of the rules, and lots of us ended up in places which were inconvenient or difficult during COVID. So you know, it doesn't change that story.